I came home that evening expecting the same thing I always expect, which is nothing special, just quiet, maybe some food, maybe a shower, and then I sit down and unwind a bit before the next day. It had been a long day, nothing dramatic, just the usual kind of work that drains you slowly without anything memorable happening. And all I really wanted was to get inside, close the door, and have that feeling that the space I paid for and built up for myself was still mine. The first thing that fell off was something small, and if it had been anything else, I probably would have ignored it. There were shoes by the door that didn't belong to me. Not just one pair, but two, placed casually like whoever left them there didn't think twice about it, like they were used to coming in and out. I stopped for a second, still holding my keys, and tried to remember if I had told anyone they could come over. Sometimes people ask, sometimes plans happen quickly, and you forget, so I gave myself a moment to think it through properly instead of reacting immediately. Nothing came to mind. That didn't immediately mean something was wrong, but it was enough to make me pay attention in a way I normally wouldn't. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. They weren't quiet or hesitant. They weren't the kind of voices you hear when someone is waiting for you or unsure if they should be there. They were relaxed, casual, like people who had already settled in and made themselves comfortable. That was when it stopped feeling confusing and started feeling wrong. Not anger yet, not even frustration, just that slow realization that whatever was happening inside my apartment wasn't something I had agreed to. I closed the door behind me a little more carefully than usual, not because I was trying to be quiet, but because I was trying to understand what I was walking into before I stepped further in. As I moved toward the kitchen, I could hear plates, the sound of a chair scraping slightly against the floor, normal sounds, but not normal for a place that is supposed to be empty when you're not there. When I walked in, I saw my cousin sitting at the table, eating like he had been there for a while, like it wasn't his first minute inside. He looked up at me, completely relaxed, and said something like, "Oh, hey, I thought you'd be back later," and then went back to eating like the situation didn't need any explanation. That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know, because it told me two things at once. First, he wasn't surprised to see me, which meant he knew I lived there, obviously, but he didn't expect me to question his presence. Second, he had already built his expectation of when I would return, which means someone had told him enough details about my schedule to make him feel comfortable being there without checking with me. I didn't raise my voice or react immediately, because at that point I still wasn't sure how this had been set up, and reacting without understanding the situation fully usually makes things worse, not better. So I asked him, calmly, how he got in. He said my sister gave him a key earlier that day because he needed a place to stay for a bit. He said it casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like there was no part of that sentence that should surprise me. That was when it stopped being a misunderstanding in my head. This wasn't someone showing up unannounced and hoping I'd be okay with it. This was something that had already been decided. Not by me, but presented as if I was already part of that decision. I asked him how long he was planning to stay, not because I was agreeing to it, but because I needed to understand how far this had already gone. He said a few days, maybe a week, depending on how things worked out. Again, no hesitation, no checking if that was okay, just a statement of what was going to happen. That part stayed with me more than anything else in that moment. Not the fact that he needed a place, because that happens, and I'm not the kind of person who ignores that when someone is in a difficult situation. What mattered was how easily my space had been turned into the solution without me even being part of the conversation. I asked him where he put his things, and he pointed toward the living room, where I could now see a bag and a jacket that weren't there when I left in the morning. Small details, but enough to confirm that he wasn't just passing through. He had already settled in. At that point, I told him I needed to make a call, and I stepped out of the kitchen because I didn't want to have that conversation in front of him. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because the problem wasn't him. The problem was how he got there. I called my sister. She picked up quickly, which usually means she was expecting some kind of reaction. I told her I was home and asked her, directly, why someone else had a key to my apartment. She didn't sound surprised by the question. She explained it like it was a practical decision, like something that needed to be done quickly, and she handled it. She said he needed a place, that it was temporary, that it wasn't a big deal, and that she thought I wouldn't have a problem with it. The moment she said, "I thought you wouldn't have a problem with it," the whole thing changed for me. It sounds reasonable on the surface, but it is really just another way of skipping the question. She was replacing asking with assuming. She had turned a conversation into a decision. I told her that thinking I might be okay with something is not the same as actually asking me before giving someone access to my home. She didn't argue directly with that, but she didn't really accept it either. Instead, she started explaining the situation again, adding details about why it was urgent, why it made sense, why it would only be for a short time. And the more she explained it, the more it became clear that in her mind, the decision had already been made, and what we were doing now was not deciding, but adjusting. That's the part that bothered me. Not the situation itself, but the way I had been removed from it until the last possible moment. I told her we would talk about it properly later, because I didn't want to have that entire conversation on the phone while someone else was sitting in my kitchen, already acting like they belonged there. When I went back inside, my cousin was still eating, still relaxed, still acting like nothing about the situation needed clarification. That was when the real problem clicked for me. From his perspective, everything was already settled. From mine, it hadn't even started. And that gap is where problems like this don't just happen, they grow. I didn't push the conversation further that night, not because I accepted what was happening, but because I wanted to see how things would play out without me forcing an immediate confrontation that would turn into noise instead of clarity. My cousin stayed in the kitchen for a while, then moved into the living room like he already knew where everything was, which told me that whatever my sister explained to him, she didn't present it as a maybe. She presented it as something settled enough that he didn't feel the need to check with me once I got home. I stayed mostly quiet, not in a passive way, but in a deliberate way, because when you react too quickly in situations like that, people tend to focus on your reaction instead of what actually happened. I wanted to keep the focus where it belonged, which was on the fact that someone had been given access to my apartment without me being asked. At some point, he asked me if it was okay if he used the shower later, and the way he asked wasn't cautious. It was more like a formality, like something he already assumed was fine but still felt he should say out loud. I told him we would talk about everything properly the next day, because I didn't want to create a situation where he felt like he was the problem when the real issue was how he ended up there in the first place. That night didn't feel like my place anymore, not in an obvious way, but in the small details that you only notice when something is off. Things weren't moved dramatically, nothing was broken or out of place in a way that would justify a strong reaction, but the atmosphere had changed. There's a difference between having someone over and having someone already settled in. And that difference is subtle, but it matters. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, partly because I didn't sleep properly and partly because I knew I needed to deal with this before it turned into something that would be harder to control later. He was still asleep in the living room, and seeing that confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't temporary in the way people say something is temporary just to make it easier to accept. This had already been treated like a short-term arrangement. I didn't wake him up. I got ready quietly and left for work. But before I did, I texted my sister and told her we needed to talk properly that day, not over the phone, not in passing, but in a way where there was no confusion about what we were discussing. She replied a bit later, saying she understood and that we could meet in the afternoon. That part sounded reasonable, but what didn't sit right with me was how calm she was about it. Not defensive, not apologetic, just calm, like she didn't see this as something that crossed a line. During the day, I kept thinking about how easily this had happened. Not just the key, not just letting someone in, but the entire chain of decisions that led to that moment. At no point in that chain was I included, and that's not something that happens accidentally. That's something that happens when someone believes they can make that kind of decision on your behalf. When we met later that day, it wasn't in a formal setting, just a regular place we've met before, which made the conversation feel normal on the surface, even though it wasn't. She started by explaining the situation again, more details this time, about why he needed a place, how things were urgent, how there wasn't much time to figure something else out. I let her speak without interrupting, because I wanted to hear everything she had to say before I responded. When she finished, I asked her a simple question. Why didn't you ask me first? She didn't avoid the question, but she didn't answer it directly either. She said she thought I would be okay with it, that we've always helped each other, that it wasn't meant to be something complicated. And that's where the conversation started to shift into something more familiar. Not an argument exactly, but a pattern. Because instead of addressing the fact that she didn't ask, she kept explaining why she believed the outcome would have been the same if she had. That's not the same thing. I told her that thinking someone might agree is not the same as giving them the chance to actually decide. And I told her that the problem wasn't just the situation, it was the fact that I was removed from it until it was already in motion. She said she didn't see it as removing me. She saw it as handling something quickly that didn't need to be complicated. That sentence is where things became clear in a different way. Because now it wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about perspective. From her point of view, she solved a problem efficiently. From mine, she crossed a boundary that shouldn't need to be explained. We went back and forth for a while, not raising our voices, not turning it into a dramatic scene, but not agreeing either. And the more we talked, the more it became obvious that she wasn't going to see it the same way I did. Not because she couldn't understand it, but because, in her mind, the outcome justified the way it was handled. At one point, she asked me if I was really going to make this into a bigger issue than it needed to be. That question wasn't aggressive, but it carried something underneath it. It suggested that the problem wasn't what happened, but how I was reacting to it. That's the moment where the conversation changes direction. Because now it's no longer about the original action. It's about whether you are willing to accept that action quietly or not. I told her I wasn't making it bigger than it was. I was addressing it exactly at the level it happened. Giving someone access to my home without asking me is not a small thing. It doesn't become small just because the intention behind it was to help someone. She didn't argue that point directly, but she didn't accept it either. Instead, she started talking about how it was only temporary, how it would be over soon, how there was no need to turn it into something long-term. And that's where another pattern showed up. Minimizing. Not denying what happened, but reducing its importance so that the conversation shifts away from it. I told her that temporary or not doesn't change how it started, and that if this was something that could happen once, it could happen again. That's the part that matters. Not just what already happened, but what it allows going forward. She didn't respond to that immediately. There was a pause there that felt different from the rest of the conversation. Not because she agreed, but because she didn't have a simple way to reframe it. Eventually, she said she didn't think it would happen again because now we were talking about it. That answer sounds reasonable on the surface, but it doesn't actually address the underlying issue. Because talking about something after it happens doesn't undo the fact that it happened without you being included. We left the conversation without a clear resolution, not in a negative way, but in a way where both of us understood that we saw the situation differently and that neither of us was going to shift enough in that moment to fully align. When I got back home that evening, I already knew what I was walking into, but knowing something and experiencing it are two different things. The door was unlocked. That alone wouldn't normally mean much, but in that context it immediately told me he was inside and moving around freely, not waiting, not checking, just existing in the space like it was already his for the time being. When I walked in, I could hear something playing from the TV in the living room, and I could smell food, which meant he had used the kitchen again without asking, not in a disrespectful way on purpose, but in that casual way people do when they feel like they've already been given permission. He was on the couch, relaxed, watching something, and he looked up the same way he did the night before, not surprised, not unsure, just acknowledging that I was back. There was a familiarity in how he acted that hadn't been there the day before, like one night was enough to turn uncertainty into routine. People underestimate that part. It doesn't take long for something temporary to start feeling normal. I put my things down and went into the kitchen, not to confront him, but to see how much had changed. Some things were small, like a different plate left out, a glass in the sink that wasn't mine, a chair slightly moved out of place, nothing that would matter on its own, but together they added up to something else. The fridge had things in it that I didn't buy. That made me stop for a second. Not because someone added food, but because it meant he wasn't thinking in terms of days anymore. He was thinking in terms of staying long enough to settle in. When I went back into the living room, he asked me if I wanted some of what he made, and again, it wasn't cautious, it wasn't someone testing boundaries, it was someone acting within boundaries they believed were already set. I told him no, and then I asked him if we could talk for a minute. He muted the TV and sat up, still relaxed, but a bit more attentive now. I told him that I understood he needed a place to stay and that I wasn't trying to make things difficult for him, but that the way this was handled wasn't okay with me. He listened, nodded, and said he didn't want to cause any problems, that he thought everything was already cleared. And I believed him. That was the thing. From his side, this wasn't manipulation or taking advantage. This was him stepping into a situation that was presented as solved. I told him that it wasn't cleared with me, and that we needed to set some boundaries while he was there. That word, boundaries, changes the tone of any situation. Not aggressively, but clearly. He agreed quickly, almost too quickly, which told me he wasn't expecting resistance, but he also wasn't interested in pushing back. I told him we needed to be clear about how long he was staying, and he said he was still figuring things out, but it shouldn't be more than a week. That was already different from what he said before. Before it was a possibility. Now it was a timeline, and timelines have a way of stretching if they're not defined properly. I told him that we needed to agree on a specific time frame, not a flexible one, because I didn't want this to become open-ended. He said he understood and that he would try to sort things out as quickly as possible. That word stuck with me, because trying doesn't mean finishing. It leaves room for things to drag out. And that's exactly how situations like this grow without anybody making a new decision out loud. At first, he would tell me if he was heading out, just as a courtesy, but after a while, that stopped. Not because he was being disrespectful on purpose, but because once something becomes routine, people stop thinking about it consciously. That's how boundaries fade. Not through conflict, through repetition. One evening, I came home and he wasn't there, but his things were spread out more than before. A jacket on the chair, his bag partially open, some of his belongings on the table. It didn't look temporary anymore. It looked like someone who had started to settle. That was when I started thinking less about the situation itself and more about what it represented. Because it wasn't just about him being there. It was about how easily my space had been redefined without my input. And once that happens, the actual details become secondary. A couple of days later, something else happened that made things clearer in a way that wasn't subtle anymore. I came home earlier than usual, and when I opened the door, I heard more than one voice. Not just his. Another person. I stepped inside and saw him in the living room with a friend of his, both sitting there like it was a normal afternoon. They stopped talking when they saw me, not in a guilty way, but in that quick adjustment people make when they realize they might need to explain something. He introduced me casually, like I was the one entering a space that was already in use. That was where it crossed the line again. Because now it's not just about someone staying. It's about that person extending the same assumption to others. I didn't react immediately. Not because I was okay with it, but because I wanted to understand if this was something he thought was allowed or something he didn't think about at all. I asked him how long his friend was planning to stay. He said not long, just visiting. In any other place, that might have sounded harmless. In mine, it meant he was already treating the apartment like a space he could extend to other people without checking with me first. I told him we needed to talk again, this time more clearly, because things were starting to move in a direction I wasn't willing to accept. His friend left shortly after that, sensing that the situation wasn't as casual as it looked when he walked in. And that left me and my cousin in a space that didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt defined, not by what was said, but by what had already happened. I told him that having someone else in my apartment without me knowing was not okay, regardless of how temporary or casual it seemed. He said he didn't think it would be a problem, that it was just for a short time. It was the same pattern again, reducing something that crossed a line until it sounded too small to challenge. That this was a space he could extend to other people without checking with me. He nodded again, more seriously this time. But by that point, it wasn't just about what he understood. It was about what had already happened. And once something happens once, it changes what's possible the next time. That night, I didn't feel like I was sharing my space. I felt like I was trying to regain control over it. And that's a very different situation. By the time that second situation happened, with his friend being there like it was a normal extension of him staying, I knew this wasn't something that was going to fix itself just by setting a few boundaries in conversation. Because the pattern was already there. It wasn't about one decision anymore. It was about how that decision kept expanding without anyone stopping to check if it should. That night, after his friend left and things went quiet again, I told him we needed to sit down and be very clear about what was happening going forward. Not in a confrontational way, but in a way that removed any room for interpretation. He sat down across from me, and this time he didn't look as relaxed as before. Not nervous exactly, but aware that this wasn't the same kind of conversation we had earlier. I told him I wasn't comfortable with how things had been unfolding, and that while I understood he needed a place to stay, the situation had already moved beyond what I would consider acceptable. I explained it slowly, Not because I thought he wouldn't understand, but because I wanted to make sure there was no way for anything to be misunderstood later. I told him that having someone else in my apartment without me knowing was not something I was going to allow again, regardless of how short the visit was supposed to be. I told him that we needed to agree on a fixed timeline for how long he would stay, and that it wasn't going to be open-ended or dependent on how things worked out. And I told him that if we were going to continue this arrangement even for a few more days, it needed to be on terms that I was actually part of, not something that kept evolving around me. He listened, and this time he didn't try to minimize anything. He said he understood, and that he didn't want to cause problems, and that he thought everything had been cleared in advance. That line came back again, and it sounded just as wrong. Everything had been cleared, just not with me. I told him that I believed he wasn't trying to take advantage, but that the way the situation was set up put him in a position where he was acting based on information that wasn't accurate. And that's not something he could fix on his own. That part belonged somewhere else. After we talked, things felt more controlled, at least on the surface. But control after something has already escalated is different from control from the beginning. It's reactive, not stable. The next step wasn't about him anymore. It was about where this actually started. The next day, I told my sister we needed to meet again, and this time I was more direct about it. I didn't frame it as a conversation. I framed it as something that needed to be resolved. When we met, the tone was different from before. Last time, it was discussion. This time, it was clarity. I told her exactly what had happened since we last spoke, including the situation with another person being in my apartment without me knowing. She looked surprised at that. Not defensive, not dismissive, just surprised. And that told me something important. She hadn't thought past the initial decision. She hadn't considered how it would evolve once it started. I told her that this was exactly why the way it was handled mattered. Because once you set something in motion like that, you don't control how it develops. She said she didn't expect it to go that far. And I believe that. But that doesn't change what it became. I told her that I needed her to understand something very clearly. This wasn't about helping or not helping. This was about the fact that my home is not something that can be offered to other people without me being part of that decision from the beginning. Not assumed. Not decided for me. Actually discussed. She didn't interrupt this time. She listened. And the difference in how she listened compared to before was noticeable. Before, she was explaining. Now, she was processing. I told her that I wasn't going to continue the situation as it was. That I was willing to give a short, defined period for him to sort things out, because I'm not trying to create a problem for someone who is already in a difficult situation. But that this was not going to continue beyond that. No extensions. No adjustments. No reinterpretations later. A clear end. And I told her something else that mattered more than the timeline. That this couldn't happen again. Not in any form. Not with keys. Not with assumptions. Not with decisions presented as already agreed. Because once that line is crossed, it changes how everything works after. She asked me what I expected her to do now. And that's a different kind of question. Because it's not about defending what already happened. It's about what comes next. I told her that for now, I expected her to support the timeline we set, not extend it, not complicate it, and not present it differently to anyone else. And more importantly, I expected that going forward, if something involves me, it includes me from the beginning, not at the end. There was a pause there. Not a long one, but long enough to feel like something shifted. She said she understood. Not in the same way she said it before. This time it didn't sound like agreement, just to move past the conversation. It sounded like recognition. We didn't drag the conversation out. There was nothing else to explain at that point. Either it was clear, or it wasn't. And it felt clear enough to move forward. When I got home that evening, things were quieter. Not physically, but in how the space felt. My cousin was still there, but he wasn't moving around as freely as before. Not restricted, but aware. Once that awareness is there, everything changes a little, because now it wasn't assumed. Now it was defined. The next few days passed without anything new happening on the surface, and that was exactly what made the situation feel different. Nothing escalated. Nothing exploded. But nothing went back to how it was either. My cousin stayed within the timeline we agreed on, and for the most part, he kept things low-key. He didn't bring anyone else over. He didn't move things around the way he had before, and he made it clear through his behavior that he understood the situation had changed. Not because he suddenly saw things the way I did, but because the boundaries were now explicit. And when boundaries are explicit, people adjust. That doesn't mean everything is fixed. It just means things stop expanding. We didn't have any more long conversations about it. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been said, and repeating it wouldn't change anything further. On the last day he was there, he packed his things without making it into a moment. No long goodbyes, no awkward explanations, just a short conversation where he said he appreciated me letting him stay and that he didn't mean to overstep. I told him I understood, and I did, because from his side, this wasn't about taking advantage. It was about stepping into a situation that had been presented to him as already arranged. He left, and just like that, the apartment was quiet again. The kind of quiet I was used to. But it didn't feel exactly the same. Not worse. Just different. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way I looked at the door when I walked in, checking something I never used to check before. The way I thought about who had access to the space, even though logically I knew nothing had changed since the conversation. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. And once you have that, you don't go back to not having it. A few days later, I saw my sister again. It wasn't a planned conversation about what happened. It was just one of those normal situations where you end up in the same place at the same time. We talk like we usually do. Normal topics, nothing connected to what happened. A few days after he left, I ended up doing something I probably should have done much earlier, which was sitting down and working out exactly how many keys to the apartment were actually out there and who had ever had access to them. I had never treated that as a serious question before because it never felt like one. I had my set, there was a spare, and in my head that was the end of it. After what happened, it stopped feeling that simple. I went through drawers, checked where I kept old duplicates, and tried to remember every time over the years that I had handed a key to somebody for a practical reason and then stopped thinking about it afterward. None of that felt dramatic while I was doing it. It felt annoyingly normal, which was part of why it bothered me. I wasn't acting out of panic. I was acting out of the kind of caution that only shows up after you realize someone else treated your home like a problem they had permission to solve for you. I didn't end up changing the locks, mostly because I knew where the key had gone and I got it back, but the fact that I even considered it would have sounded excessive to me before all of this. Afterward, it didn't sound excessive at all. It sounded proportionate. The other thing that changed was much less visible and probably more important. Before this, if someone in the family called and said they needed something quickly, my first instinct was usually to figure out how to make it work and sort the details out later. That instinct didn't disappear, but it stopped being automatic. Now there was a pause where there hadn't been one before. Not because I became cold, and not because I was keeping score, but because once somebody turns your space into a shared solution without your permission, you stop assuming that urgency will be handled responsibly just because it is coming from family. A week or two later, my sister asked me for help with something much smaller, just picking something up and dropping it off because she was tied up and couldn't get there in time. I still helped. The difference was that she actually asked, waited for an answer, and then responded to the answer instead of acting like the answer already existed. It was such a small change in the moment that most people probably wouldn't have noticed it, but I noticed it immediately. That was what made the whole thing feel real afterward. Not an apology, not a speech, not some perfect conversation where everybody finally agreed on the meaning of what happened. Just a change in behavior that showed she understood, at least enough, that my yes was supposed to come from me and not from whatever she assumed I would probably say. If someone else had been there, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything different. We talked the way we usually talked, and nothing in the conversation would have sounded unusual from the outside. The difference was in the pauses, in the way certain things were said a little more carefully than before. At one point, she mentioned something about helping someone else with a situation, and I noticed something immediately. She didn't attach my name to it. She didn't assume anything. She spoke about it as her decision, her involvement. That stood out to me more than any apology would have. She didn't need to explain the whole thing again. The change was already there, and I didn't need to point it out for it to matter. There was no final conversation where everything got wrapped up neatly, and that's probably the most realistic part of it. Things don't always end with full agreement. Sometimes they just settle, and the change stays there whether anyone names it or not. I still help when it makes sense, but it isn't treated like an automatic answer anymore. That's the difference. Before, help was assumed. Now, it has to be asked for. We still talk. We still see each other. Nothing completely broke. But it isn't the same, and it probably shouldn't be. Once something like that happens, you don't go back to not knowing it can happen. You just move forward a little differently.